to our speakers for today. These are three of my most favorite colleagues. Don't tell the others, okay? And again, we're discussing the 411 on NSF, National Science Foundation, as a sponsor. So first up, we have Kelly Belga, Post-Award Finance Specialist 3. She's with our Award Management Unit. And I will read you a little bit about her bio. So Kelly Belga, she's been a part of the Award Management Team and Office of Research since 2018. She's worked in various capacities at 2 higher education universities, including Florida Atlantic University and University of Central Florida. Her higher ed experience includes research administration at the central office, college, and department levels, fiscal and human resource administration at the department level, and fundraising administration at the college level. Prior to her higher ed experience, she also worked as a systems consultant for Anderson Consulting, Accenture in the areas of business requirements development, software design, programming, testing, and user support. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and a Master's of Business Administration degree from Loyola University, Chicago. Our next speaker that we have is our very own Sreela Mallick. So Ms. Sreela Mallick is a Post-Award Finance Specialist 3 in the Award Management Unit of Research at the University of Central Florida. She has over 33 years. Go ahead and congratulate her on those 33 years. She has over 33 years of professional experience, including 20 years at UCF. Over these 33 years, she has worked in many capacities and in various senior management roles, both in the corporate sector in India and the university environment in Florida. While at UCF, Ms. Mallick has managed various research activities at the department level for over 17 years before moving to the Office of Research in 2017. And I'm so glad that we got her. At the department level, her work experience has involved coordinating project management for multiple principal investigators throughout the life of their sponsored projects, not only within her unit, but also amongst various departments within UCF, and even the sponsored research offices of other Florida universities through her involvement with the NASA Florida Space Grant Program. Prior to her position, let me go ahead and expand my view here. Prior to her position, she was, let's see, find my place here. Okay, so she was the Assistant Director of the NASA Florida Space Grant Consortium. The NASA Florida Space Grant Consortium is a statewide network of 17 public and private Florida universities, all of Florida's community colleges, and various other organizations such as Space Florida, Orlando Science Center, and the Astronaut Memorial Foundation. Ms. Mallick received her education in corporate law and finance in India before immigrating to the US. Before joining the NASA Florida Space Grant Consortium, Ms. Mallick was the Senior Manager of Corporate Affairs at a multinational company in India where she managed various portfolios, included corporate affairs, legal administration, employee taxation, and trade union negotiations on behalf of the company. And finally, we have our very own Shannon Callahan, Post-Award Finance Specialist 3, Award Management Unit, of course. So she has served as Post-Award Finance Specialist 3, Award Manager in the Office of Research at the University of Central Florida since 2018. After earning her bachelor's degree from UCF in English Technical Communication with a Legal Studies minor, she proceeded to devote her professional career to public service in the education sector. She has amassed over 17 years of combined experience at educational institutions in grant development, management, and research administration, supporting related activities during all points of the funding cycle. Before returning to UCF as an employee, she wrote grant proposals and supported award implementation at the school district of Osceola County, Florida for nearly 14 years. Go ahead and take it away, ladies.
Well, first of all, we'd like to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And to start off, we have just a few poll questions to sort of gauge what stage you all are in your research administration careers, to see what types of institutions you all come from, and to gauge your familiarity with NSF. Elizabeth, please, can you put up the first poll? So our first question is, what type of organization do you work for? And it looks like the majority are from institutions of higher ed from outside of Florida. All right, Elizabeth, can you put up the second poll? And it looks like the vast majority have anywhere from 3 to 10 years of work experience. And then Elizabeth, the last poll, please. All right, so from the polls, it looks like we have quite a range as expected in terms of experience and familiarity with NSF, from newcomers all the way through to very seasoned research administrators, as well as representation from institutions from both inside and outside of Florida. Our session today is intended to be an introductory FAQ of sorts to having NSF as a sponsor, and we will be touching on various topics in treatment of expenditures on NSF grants. So if Elizabeth, if you could move to the next slide, please. Now, our first topic is equipment, which is referenced under the property standards 2 CFR 200, section 310 through 316, as well as in the NSF PAPG, the Proposal and Award Policies Procedures Guide. So what is equipment and how is it defined? Equipment is defined as tangible, non-expendable personal property, and for purposes of NSF grants is considered exempt property that has a useful life of more than 1 year and an acquisition cost of $5,000 or more per unit. Allowable items charged to direct costs are normally limited to research or special purpose equipment intended for use only for research, medical or scientific purposes, for instance. Microscopes or spectrometers, those types of specialized items can be considered as special purpose equipment. Now, can an institution set a lower threshold than $5,000 for equipment? Yes, if it is consistent with the institution's policies, an institution can establish and set a lower threshold than $5,000 for equipment. Here at UCF, we do adhere to the $5,000 threshold. And then what should be included in the acquisition cost of equipment? The acquisition cost of equipment should include any costs necessary to ready the equipment for its intended use and should include the new invoice price of the equipment, any sort of modifications, attachments, accessories, any sort of auxiliary apparatus necessary to make it usable for the purpose for which it was acquired. In addition, other ancillary charges such as installation, transportation, taxes, or even protective in-transit insurance may also be included in the unit acquisition costs of equipment if it is consistent with the awardee's regular accounting practices. Now, keeping in mind that grantees are also to ensure that with each purchase of equipment, that it's necessary for the research or activity supported by the grant, that it is not otherwise readily available or accessible, that it is of the type that is normally charged as a direct cost to sponsored agreements, meaning it must be special purpose equipment. And last, that it is acquired in accordance with organizational practice. Next slide, please. So are equipment charges incurred past the award date allowable? Typically, costs of equipment ordered after the award expiration date may not be charged to the project. However, the commitment of project funds is valid if the specialized equipment was ordered well in advance of the award expiration date. But let's say due to some unusual or unforeseen circumstances, delivery of the equipment was delayed beyond the expiration date of the award. Those equipment charges would then be allowable. In addition, discretion should always be used when ordering equipment in anticipation of the end date of the grant, where there is either little or no time remaining for those items to be utilized in the actual conduct of research. Here at UCF, when requests for equipment purchases are made less than 90 days from the award end date, additional justification noting the reason for the late purchase is required as part of our pre-expenditure review. Now, are general purpose equipment charges allowable? General purpose equipment refers to equipment that is not limited to research, medical, scientific, or other technical activities. For instance, telephones, copy machines, those types of items. Typically, expenditures for general purpose equipment are not allowable unless the equipment is primarily or exclusively used in the actual conduct of research. And best practice in these scenarios would be to provide specific justification details as to why it is necessary to purchase this general purpose equipment for grant funds and how it would be used exclusively in the actual conduct of research, such that prior sponsor approval may be obtained. And then finally, who does equipment title vest with? Unless it is otherwise specified in the grant, title to the equipment purchased or fabricated with NSF grant funds will vest with the grantee upon acquisition. However, NSF may identify items of equipment having an acquisition cost of $5,000 or more, where NSF may reserve the right to transfer title to either the federal government or a third party named by the federal government at any time during the grant period. In cases where NSF chooses to do so, disposition instructions would be issued no later than 120 days after the end date of the NSF award. Now, Sreela will go on to discuss the treatment of participant support costs. Next slide, please.
So thank you, Kelly. So on NSF award letters, we very often see the term participant support costs included in the budget. So what is participant support cost? Participant support costs are governed by 22 CFR 200.75 and are direct costs for items such as stipend or subsistence allowances, travel allowances, registration fees paid to or on behalf of participants in connection with NSF-sponsored conferences. One thing to keep in mind here is that participant support cost cannot be disbursed to employees within your organization. The other thing to remember while discussing stipend payments using PSC funds is that the payments should be disbursed using the stipend mechanism through your university's accounting system and not via payroll. So you may well think, okay, we know we are paying the participant a fixed amount as stipend. We know that we are paying it from our PSC funds. So what does it matter to anyone what mechanism we use? How does processing stipend through payroll affect anything, right? So to answer that question, as you are aware, salaries and wages are processed through payroll and are paid as compensation for work performed. Whereas stipend, on the other hand, is not compensation for work done, but rather it is for monetary support for a variety of reasons, such as expenses during a training period or cover certain living expenses, that kind of stuff. Therefore, because payroll charges are processed against timesheets, they accrue FICA as well as indirect costs. If you do stipends through payroll, that basically becomes contrary to the definition of stipend as per the guidelines, and it'll veer away from the nature of stipend payment. And that might later on cause more scrutiny at the time of audit. The other thing is also it has a very negative impact on the PSC budget, which is accounted for separately, since now indirect charges are going to post to those payroll expenses. And as you know, indirect cost is not allowed on participant support cost funds. So at UCF, what they do is if they have a participant who happens to be a UCF student, our taxation office, our taxation unit, they're located within the FNA office. They will usually be contacted to review that student's involvement in that particular sponsored project. And based on their evaluation, if they determine that the student's involvement is purely for academic advancement, they will confirm that a stipend can be paid to the student. And once the department receives that confirmation, they initiate a purchase order for the student. Again, keeping in mind that they're using the stipend account code in UCF financials. And then once the PO is set up, the students will submit invoices and collect payment like any other vendor. Typically at UCF, we normally do not pay the entire stipend amount up front. Stipends are usually dispersed as a fixed amount in maybe 2 or 3 installments, depending on the program and the duration of the involvement. So what actions require prior approval for participant support cost? NSF prior approval is required for any additional categories of participant support costs, such as incentive, gifts, souvenirs, etc. So for example, if you're distributing custom printed t-shirts with the NSF conference name, or a bag with the conference name printed on it, or gift cards for participating in the conference, those will require prior NSF approval before you post it to the project. So if at the proposal stage, the PI is aware that these type of charges are likely to be incurred, or he wants to do this to attract better students as participants or something like that, it is always best to include them in the funding proposal itself, along with the budget justification, detailing the amount you want to spend in this type of expense, why that is necessary, and how you think that is going to benefit your project as a whole. Now, if it is not included in the funding proposal, then you will need prior approval from NSF before you incur those charges and post them to the sponsored project funded by NSF, or to the cost share project if one applies to this award. So another good thing to remember here is that transfer of funds budgeted for participant support costs to other categories of expense will require prior approval, while if you go the other way and transfer non-participant support cost budget into participant support cost, you don't need prior approval. So that's a good tip to remember. Are indirect costs allowable on participant support cost? No, they are not, and therefore they must be accounted for separately. In fact, the NSF award letter contains standard language stating that the requirements discussed here. It'll say that prior approval is required from NSF to divert PSC funds to other categories and to keep PSC funds segregated from other non-participant support cost funds. Next slide, please. So how do we submit a prior approval request to rebudget participant support cost? So for that, we have to log into research.gov, and I have a little clip of a screenshot from the research.gov portal. And this page is pretty much a starting point for almost all requests that are submitted to NSF, either for notification or prior approval, which we will discuss the differences later. So depending on the nature of your request, you can either select the radio button if you know which one to click in step 1, or you can click on all, and then that'll open up in step 2. It opens up all the options that are available, and then you can just click the one which best suits your request. Now, once you select the step 2 process and click on go, it opens up another third box now. And there you have to enter the NSF grant number. That's the one highlighted here in yellow. Once you click on that, next slide, please. You go on to Fastlane. And in Fastlane, you have to follow the prompts basically to submit it. But here in this left-hand red column, there is a drop down of all the active NSF awards that are in your university at that time. So from the drop down, you have to select the one which applies to the request that you are now wanting to submit, and you prepare new. Once you click on prepare new, it opens up another screen in NSF, which is broadly separated into 2 columns. The left column is for NSF notifications which do not require prior approval, and the right column will have radio buttons for prior approval. So reallocation of funds provided for participant support costs, since it needs prior approval, will be on that right-hand column. So after you select the appropriate radio button, just follow the prompts to complete your submission. And then remember to click submit as the final step. There have been many times where I've forgotten to click the final, so it sits in draft status that way. It's relatively simple, shouldn't be too complicated. So to keep in mind here is that only the PI or the sponsored program official who has SPO access in NSF can submit these requests. So at University of Central Florida, what we do is that the request is initiated by the research administrators at the department level, because they're the ones working with the PI. They know how much they need, why they need it, all that justification and information is something they would be privy to. So once they submit it and they initiate it in research.gov and Fastlane, once they are done with their part, they submit it over to the award management office within Office of Research. And here the person with the SPO access is going to complete the submission to NSF. So if NSF approves the request, they may either send you a formal award amendment or a simple one-line email from the NSF program officer stating that the submitted request to reallocate PSC funds is approved. And once you have that email, you can at that point process the budget transfer, but be very sure to document that email in case of future audits. In the next slide, Kelly will discuss salaries and wages. Kelly, take it away, please.
Thank you, Sreela. Now for the treatment of salaries and wages, we can reference 2 CFR 200, section 413, as well as the NSF APG. So are salaries and wages allowed on NSF awards? First, as it pertains to faculty salaries, NSF regards research as one of the normal functions of faculty members at higher ed institutions, and therefore compensation for time normally spent on research within the term of appointment is usually deemed to be included within the faculty member's regular organizational salary. So as a general policy, NSF limits salary compensation requested on proposal budgets for senior personnel to no more than 2 months of their regular salary in any 1 year. And it is the organization's responsibility to define and consistently apply that term year, whether the faculty member is employed as a 9-month or 12-month faculty, and is specified this definition accordingly in the budget justification. Now, with regards to administrative and clerical staff, their salaries are normally treated as indirect costs, and charging these types of salaries as direct costs to an NSF grant may be appropriate only if all of the following conditions are met. First, the administrative or clerical services need to be integral to the project or activity. Second, the individuals involved need to be specifically identified with the project or activity. Third, the costs need to be explicitly included in the approved budget or have prior written approval of the cognizant NSF grants officer. And finally, the costs are not already recovered as indirect costs. And last is the salaries of postdocs and students. Postdoctoral associates with approved mentoring plans, as well as graduate and undergraduate students who will be involved directly on the project, can be funded with NSF grant funds. Next slide, please. Now we'll move on to discuss whether or not prior approval is needed for the rebudgeting of salaries and wages. Under normal rebudgeting authority, an NSF grantee is authorized to rebudget salaries and wages in accordance with the research terms and conditions prior approval matrix. And Shannon will discuss that later on. Additionally, a grantee can internally approve an increase or decrease in person months devoted to the project after an award is made, even if doing so results in the salary support for the senior personnel exceeding that 2-month salary policy that we discussed earlier. That being said, however, NSF does require prior approval to rebudget salaries and wages in the following scenarios. First, if the rebudgeting of salary involves a change in objectives or scope of the project. For instance, this would be the case if the scope of work for a project changes substantially such that the PI needs to devote more time and effort towards completing the work. Prior approval would be required. Or if the rebudgeting of salary is a result of the approved project director or PI disengaging from the project for more than 3 months or reducing his or her time devoted on the project by 25% or more. As would be the case if the PI were to say experience some sort of personal or health issue preventing him or her from working on the project for 3 months or more. Prior approval would also be required there. And last, if rebudgeting of salary involves the direct charging of salaries of administrative and clerical staff, where Conditions that were noted in the previous slide were not met. Other than these scenarios, no other additional approvals from NSF are necessary for the rebudgeting of salaries and wages. And now Shannon will move on to discuss grantee notifications. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Kelly. So what actions require grantee notifications to NSF? NSF has established parameters regarding the project adjustments for which the grantee must submit notification before taking action. These changes appear in the bulleted list. A common example is the grantee approved no-cost extension, which is a one-time extension of the end date for up to 12 months to assure adequate completion of the original scope of work within the funds already made available. Do notifications require prior NSF approval? No, and no amendment will be issued. Notifications provide information to NSF that will assure the accuracy of NSF's grant data. How are notifications submitted to NSF? The short answer is that all of them go through NSF's research.gov and Fastlane portals. The website noted at the top of the slide contains complete details. It refers to the full listing in NSF's proposal and award policies and procedures guide, but also provides a summary table with the action type, notification or request designation, policy citation, and submission location, which is either Fastlane or research.gov. The type will dictate whether the principal investigator and or sponsored project office will create and submit the notification in the corresponding portal. Next slide, please. So what actions require prior approval? The answer is that many project adjustments require NSF prior approval. These changes go beyond the mostly one-way nature of notifications. On the post-award side, it is important to become familiar with the list on this slide. The presentation will be available after the conference for everyone to review, but I want to highlight some instances that may arise on a fairly regular basis, including changes in key personnel or contributions to the project, which Kelly discussed a few slides ago, changes in objectives or scope, and rebudgeting of participant support costs, commonly called PSC, funds for non-PSC costs, which Sreela discussed earlier in the presentation. The last bullet mentions NSF approved no-cost extensions, which may occur frequently, especially during the COVID era when delays have almost become a certainty. Whereas the first grantee approved no-cost extension requires only a notification 10 days prior to the current end date, the deadline for submitting an NSF prior approval request for the second and subsequent no-cost extensions is 45 days before the current end date. Next slide, please. How are requests for prior approval submitted to NSF and what information is needed? Depending on the type, the requester will use the research.gov or Fastlane portal's notification module and then select the pertinent category or choose the other category if the specific option does not appear. The request must include all of the particulars of the changes and justification for those changes. Next slide, please. Okay, so you heard earlier the FDP matrix mentioned. What is the FDP matrix? This slide discusses the Federal Demonstration Partnership, or FDP. UCF is a member of the FDP, which brings together 10 federal agencies and 217 institutional recipients, mostly universities. Its grant mechanism uses a standardized and simplified set of terms and conditions across all participating agencies, which maximizes resources available for research by minimizing administrative costs. Each award will stipulate if and when project changes require prior approval. Some prior approval requirements are waived for FDP members. The FDP prior approval matrix is a very helpful reference for post-award actions. This slide contains a link to the website where the matrix is available. Next slide, please. As mentioned previously, certain language in the award will signal that the FDP prior approval matrix applies. For example, the award might state, this institution is a signatory to the Federal Demonstration Partnership Phase 6 agreement. That phrase indicates a clear connection to the FDP prior approval matrix. It is important to note that there are several iterations of the matrix as the content has undergone updating to reflect the changing regulatory landscape. So which version applies to a grant? The award issue date will determine which version is applicable. Federal grants that originate this year will usually rely on the most current FDP matrix dated November 12, 2020. Older awards will use a previous version that aligns with their issue date. This slide contains a link to the repository for the current and previous publications. And now I will hand it back to Sreela for a discussion of everyone's favorite subject, mandatory cost share.
So now we jump into the fun world of required cost share, which, as Shannon mentioned, is everyone's favorite, right? So the terms mandatory and required cost share are being used interchangeably here, and they're governed by 22 CFR 200-306. So is cost share required on NSF grants? It's not a common requirement. You don't see it very often, but most awards, which are like the Research Instrumentation Program awards or some awards at NSF other than those ones, may include required cost share. If it is required, then the required cost share amount will be included on the award letter, and it will, in that case, become legally binding, subject to audit, as well as reporting requirements. So if there is required cost share, it must be documented and reported on an annual and final basis and submitted as a notification via the research.gov and Fastlane portals. And the cost share report must be certified by the person who has AOR access with NSF within your organization. So not everyone can do it. It's only the AORs who have access to submit that. So in our university, what they do is we have the grants accounting team who are assigned to the PI's department. They are the ones who monitor the required cost share, and they prepare the annual and final cost share report for each reporting period offline. That document is then provided to the AOR, who is in the award management unit, who completes the submission to NSF using the Fastlane portal. So annual cost share reports must be submitted no later than 90 days prior to the end of the current budget period. And the final cost share report must be submitted no later than 120 days following the award end date. For multi-year projects, if a cost share report is not submitted, that may delay release of the next year's funds. So it is always best to be proactive and submit the annual cost share report as soon as it becomes due. Don't take any further time, just have it prepared, do it as quickly as you can, because that would allow the next installment of funds to be released. I've also seen in the past where NSF program officers will reach out to the PIs ahead of time and request that the annual cost share report be submitted so they can release the next installment. In those cases, it is best to submit the cost share report as soon as possible and not wait for that 90-day period, so that there is no delay or disruption in follow-on funding from NSF, from the NSF side. So unless we do these reports, the annual cost share reports, they can't release the funds. If they want to release it to us ahead of time, they'll ask for the report ahead of time. That's fine, just go ahead and do that as soon as they ask for it. And like with all cost share, only the amount of expenditures posted to the cost share project can be reported as cost share met. Future anticipated expenses and encumbrances cannot be counted for reporting purposes. So that's something to keep in mind when you're trying to meet your cost share, especially towards the end when you're down to the wire. Make sure the encumbrances are liquidated, everyone's paid off, whoever needs to get paid. So then you can use that number as in your report. Next slide, please. So where is cost share noted on the award letter? If cost share is required, then the required cost share information will be reflected in the award letter in the funding information section, which is usually on page 1 of the award letter, which is the first clip up here showing funding information. You will always see this. If there is cost share, there'll be a dollar amount written. Otherwise, that line will still appear and will show 0. And also it will show up on line M on the budget details, which are included on the award letter, usually on the last page. That is that second clip you see here. So if you see a discrepancy between the amounts detailed in that first page funding amount and in that last page line M, it is best to reach out to the NSF grants official. I've seen this in a number of cases. It's a typo at their end, and then they will issue a revised award letter to correct it so these two numbers align. It is important to get them aligned because this number is then later on going to show up in your reports by default on the Fastlane site, which we'll get to in a couple of minutes. Next slide, please. So we got the award, it is required cost share, everything's going along fine. And now 2 years later, the PI informs us that maybe he will not be able to meet the required cost share. So now what to do? So maybe his subcontractor, let's assume he's got a subcontract who had cost share commitment and they are not going to be able to meet it. They've just told the PI 2 years later that they can't. So now what do? We are responsible to NSF for the full committed amount. So if you become aware that it's not possible to meet the cost share as in line M, it's best to immediately contact the program officer and let them know that this is happening. So basically what that means is that you should submit your request to NSF to adjust your cost share commitment by explaining how much of the previously committed cost share you fear that you will not be able to meet, why you think you will not be able to meet it, what steps have you already taken to identify alternate sources of cost share, but you still haven't been able to come up with that amount, whether you plan to continue and complete the proposed scope of work even without the cost share money, or do you want to reduce the scope or phase out the project due to the shortfall in your cost share budget. So let's say that the PI, of course, you will get back to the PI and say, hey, do you want me to submit this report to NSF? Not the report, but the notification, because this is something you would have to inform NSF prior. It requires prior approval to reduce your cost share commitment. So if the PI gave you the go-ahead to submit this request to NSF to seek approval for reduced cost share, how do you submit that request? So the request is to be submitted by creating a notification using the other category in the notification module. And like I said before, there are certain information which the PI can provide you as to why you are not able to meet the cost share, what are your alternate sources that you've already explored and that kind of thing. In these type of situations, it's always best to recommend that the PI talk to the NSF program officer frankly to make them aware of the situation and discuss possible remedial measures before you formally submit the request to NSF. That is actually to your advantage, so that once they get the report, the submission from the portal, the NSF program officer is not caught off guard and is already aware of the unique scenario in which the PI has been forced to make this request. That would lead to a more favorable decision from the NSF end, would probably help to avoid termination of the grant due to failure to meet cost share commitment. We don't want to see that, but might happen if they don't know about it in advance. So what are the potential outcomes? So if NSF agrees to the proposed reduced cost share plans that you've submitted via the other notification, a modification to the award letter will be provided to the university, reducing the amount of the cost share commitment, and that amount will then show up in future cost share reports which will be submitted. But should the organization's plan for reduced cost share not be acceptable to NSF, the NSF funded portion of the award may be reduced, or in worst cases, the award may be subject to termination. We don't want to see that happen, but it is a possibility. So that is why, as I mentioned before, an open dialogue between the PI and the NSF program officer before we submit this request formally is a very good idea. Mostly, I would suggest that you follow that practice if you could. Next slide, please. So moving on to cost share reports. How do we submit those? So cost share reports are to be prepared by submitting a notification in the research.gov portal. And like I mentioned before, this is only done by AORs who have that access within your institution. So again, like I mentioned before, this prepare new notification request is kind of the starting point for everything. So if you click on other in step 1, it opens up this box in step 2, and you can choose annual and final cost share notification by recipient from that drop down, which will appear for you once you click on other in step 1. Next slide, please. So once you do step 1, 2, and 3, and it takes you to Fastlane. So again, a new screen will pop up. From that prepare new little drop-down list of all active awards, select the one which you're trying to submit the report for, and then click on prepare new. And as I mentioned in an earlier slide, on the left side will be the radio buttons for different grantee notification types. And here you will see a radio button for cost sharing. And remember also, as in Shannon's earlier slide, cost sharing is a notification only, does not require prior NSF approval. So select the cost sharing button on the left side of the screen. It will take you to a screen where you will follow the prompts to complete your submission. And once you have completed all the information, remember to click the submit button. Next slide. So you've submitted you've entered all the information, you've clicked the submit to NSF button. So how do you check whether you really submitted and it went to NSF or not? So if you go back to the Fastlane site again and you click and you select the project, the award number, you will see this little box submitted to NSF up on top, and the status down below in the little box which says submitted to NSF. That is basically confirming that you have actually submitted it and NSF got what you've submitted. Next slide, please. So this is the last slide on this topic. So what does a submitted cost share report look like? So up here you have the 3 tabs: forwarded by PI, prepared by SPO, and submitted to NSF. When you click on that submitted to NSF tab, you will find that information, again, the status which is highlighted in yellow in this image below. That's going to show you that it is submitted. I had to redact a lot of the information which is award specific for UCF, so we couldn't include that in the public presentation slide. But this basically gives you an idea of what are the columns and what information you're going to see on it. So the amount shown in the difference column at the bottom of the page will be the line M cost share committed amount. Remember the one we talked about, the line M and funding information on the award letter page. So that amount will show, this comes in by default. So this will show up, and this difference is basically the difference between what you've reported, the cumulative cost share you've reported so far, taken out from whatever your cost share commitment is. And this difference column is basically the amount of cost share that you are yet to meet and report on this award. So at the time of final cost share reporting, this difference amount will show as 0, meaning all cost share has been met. So this time we have completed a slide presentation. So thank you for attending. And if you have any questions, please either type or let us know, and we'll be glad to answer. Thank you.
Well, thank you, ladies, for giving us the 411 on NSF. So we do have a comment here in the chat from Beverly Robertson. So she lets everyone know, be careful not to conflate the use of participants, as NSF uses the term, with how it's typically used in NIH-funded projects as subjects in research. The former is exempt from IDC and the latter is not. And message from Elizabeth. Everyone, please place any comments or questions here in the chat. We have our experts here, so feel free to engage.
Thank you, Beverly. That was a wonderful comment and very useful comment. Thank you.
All right, so let's get into some of these comments. Mary Davis says, great job, guys. Tamaria says, excellent presentation. We do have here a comment from Cindy. You mentioned contacting the program officer versus grants officer on questions on financial matters. Please explain, as we had the understanding to always contact the grants officer.
So that's an excellent question. So anything that is grants related, where you need a correction to the award letter or you need prior approval for any action that you want to take, those type of questions, yes, should go to the grants officer. When I mentioned program officer, I was actually talking about the PIs talking to the program officers ahead of time if they have cost share which they are unable to meet. So the program officers are ultimately the ones who decide whether or not the grants officer is going to say yay or nay. So if the PIs contact the program officers, who they talk to all the time, by the way, for technical matters, if they let them know that this is coming down the line, at least the program officer is not caught unawares. So you're right that for administrative changes, you need to contact the grants officer only, but it is best that the PIs talk to the program officers because they are the ones who ultimately make the decision. So it's just to give them a heads up. It's not an official notification.
That is a great response. So we have a really interesting question from Kara, and I'm interested to know the answer too, since we're in this virtual environment now, right? So from Kara, she says, as we are in a virtual world now, would it be permissible to add in a line item to cover food delivery, such as Uber Eats, etc., for a virtual panel via Zoom, in addition to the honorarium for participating?
That's a good question. So we have an expert in the room, Jennifer Shambrook. I'm going to actually refer this to her because I don't know that this is allowed. Jennifer, can you help?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, can you repeat that again?
I'll repeat that question for you, Jennifer. So Kara wants to know, as we are in a virtual world now, would it be permissible to add in a line item to cover food delivery, such as Uber Eats or etc., for a virtual panel via Zoom in addition to an honorarium for participating?
I would say that if food is allowed, and it's rare that food is allowed, if food is allowed and the virtual panel, I guess it wouldn't be virtual if everyone is together. I think it would be hard to justify. And I wouldn't do anything like that without going to the agency and being completely transparent as to what you were going to do. I would never say that it's impossible. You know, my typical answer is always it depends. But if, for example, we were having a meeting together and the meeting was being broadcast to folks like we're doing right now, there's a possibility that you could have it, but you'd have to make the case that there was no other way that people could eat. So I think you're always having, you always have to really justify when you're ordering food because of the problems that have occurred with the $65 muffins and things like that that have been very public. So sponsors are very cautious about paying for things like that because the people that gave the money to the sponsors are going to want an accounting if something is put in a bad light. So it'd be very difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it would be very difficult.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Response. So everyone, this is going to conclude our presentation. Feel free to go ahead and let the ladies know how they did in the chat. My team did amazing. I'm so glad to be a part of this wonderful, wonderful group. And we hope you learned a bunch on 411 of NSF Awards.
Thank you for presenting and for moderating.
Thank you.